Rubio confronted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with her own numbers, and for the first time that morning, the woman who had built an entire national brand on never running out of words suddenly had none left. How many cases did you actually resolve, Congresswoman? The question did not explode across room 219 of the Hart Senate office building. It hung there, colder than an accusation, cleaner than an insult, and far more damaging than either one could have been. 3 seconds passed, and in those 3 seconds, every speech, every slogan, every camera-ready lecture about justice, equity, compassion, and community collapsed into the one thing politics can never talk its way around: the record. AOC sat behind the witness table, with both hands flat against the oak surface, her mouth opening just enough to prove she intended to answer, and then closing because the number in front of her had done what Rubio's tone never needed to do. 14 hours earlier, before the room filled, before the cameras warmed, before the press row began sharpening its headlines, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez believed she was walking into another performance she could win. She had survived hostile interviews, committee ambushes, viral attacks, cable news panels, donor-class whispers, and conservative outrage cycles that usually burned hot for a day before feeding her next fundraising email. This hearing looked, from the outside, like another predictable collision: a Republican senator, a progressive congresswoman, immigration policy, sanctuary jurisdictions, cameras, partisans, and an audience already sorted into who they wanted to cheer and who they wanted to see bleed politically. But Rubio did not arrive looking for a television argument, because television arguments are where AOC was comfortable, where she could widen the frame, soften the question, turn a number into a moral sermon, and leave with the clip. He came with folders, dates, letters, response logs, grant trails, constituent complaints, and the kind of patient bureaucratic violence that does not raise its voice because it knows the paper is already enough. The hearing convened at 9:14 in the morning, and Senator Marco Rubio was already speaking before the room had settled into the usual theater of opening statements and procedural throat clearing. There was no long preamble, no patriotic fog machine, no dramatic lecture about the border, no attempt to win the room with volume, because volume would have given her something to fight. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, he began, before we begin the formal portion of today's testimony, I want to note for the record that a family in your district, the Dominguez family of Jackson Heights, filed a formal complaint with this committee about the consequences of current sanctuary jurisdiction policies. He let that name enter the official record first, not as decoration, not as an anecdote, but as a human receipt, the kind politicians love to invoke until the receipt points back at their own office. I'll come back to them, Rubio continued, but first I'd like you to confirm for the record your publicly stated position that detention funding should be reduced and redirected to community-based alternatives. Is that an accurate summary of your position? The gallery was packed so tightly that the back wall looked less like public seating and more like a pressure gauge. 3 cable networks were carrying the feed live. Digital outlets had reporters posted along the marble hallway, and every person inside that room believed they understood the script before the first page had turned. On one side sat the people who wanted AOC to do what she always did: take a Republican question, flip it into a moral indictment, and walk out as the youngest, sharpest voice in the room. On the other side sat the people who had waited years to see someone finally stop debating the performance and start auditing the office behind it. That second group did not want a shouting match. They wanted something cleaner, harsher, and more permanent. The public moment when a politician who lectures America about systems gets trapped inside the system she actually ran. AOC leaned forward in her chair with both hands wrapped around the microphone stem, wearing a white blazer over a dark blouse and the controlled expression of someone who had spent the previous week preparing not just answers, but posture. She looked focused, not frightened, energized, not defensive, almost pleased that Rubio had begun exactly where she expected him to begin. "Senator, that is an accurate summary," she said. and I appreciate the opportunity to expand on it." Then she expanded because expansion was her natural habitat, the place where a yes or no question could become a platform, where policy could become virtue, and where every uncomfortable detail could be buried beneath a moral architecture large enough to hide the missing bricks. She described the detention framework as a multi-billion-dollar machine that separated families, criminalized poverty, punished people before process, and poured taxpayer money into outcomes that, in her framing, failed both justice and basic efficiency. It was a strong answer if the hearing had been about philosophy, and AOC delivered it with the familiar rhythm that had made her famous. Quick, polished, wounded on behalf of others, and confident enough to sound like disagreement itself was cruelty. The left side of the gallery nodded along, some leaning forward with the almost physical relief of hearing their champion return to familiar ground. A low murmur moved through the room before the sergeant-at-arms killed it with one look, but the point had already been made. She still knew how to make her people feel protected. Then she added a line Rubio had not asked for, and that line mattered because it revealed she believed she was still in control of the frame. "And Senator, I hope this hearing will examine all of our records equally," she said, smiling in a way that was not warm but strategic, "because I think the committee would benefit from a complete picture." Rubio registered it with the smallest possible movement, his pen stopping for half a second above his notepad before he wrote something down and moved on. He did not object, did not spar, did not take the bait, because the bait was designed for a man who wanted to defend himself instead of prosecuting the contradiction sitting in front of him. "Thank you for that clarity, Congresswoman," he said, his tone flat enough to sound courteous and dangerous at the same time. "I want to make sure I understand your position precisely. So it is your testimony today that you have consistently advocated for reducing enforcement funding. Is that correct? Yes or no?" AOC answered without hesitation, "Yes, and I'm proud of that record." And for one clean second, it looked like she had given her supporters exactly the defiant clip they came to see. Rubio nodded, reached into the manila folder at his right hand, and removed a single sheet of paper with the quiet confidence of a man who had been waiting for that sentence. "Then, I'd like to enter into the record document 1, a letter from your own office dated 14 months ago requesting an increase in ICE operational funding for your district." The room did not gasp, because gasps belong to melodrama, and this was worse than melodrama. This was recalculation. 200 people seemed to adjust at once. Reporters dropped their eyes to keyboards. A senior aide 2 rows behind, AOC froze mid-sip with a paper coffee cup halfway to her mouth, and the gallery felt the first hard turn of the morning. The letter appeared on the overhead display, and for 12 seconds, everyone in the room stared at the kind of document that does not care how talented a politician is on camera. AOC did not panic, because panic would have been too honest, and she had been in rooms tough enough to know that the first rule of survival is to rename the problem before the audience understands it. "Senator, that letter addressed community safety resources in the context of a specific local concern raised by constituents," she said, shaping the sentence carefully, trying to take the sharp edge off the phrase ICE operational funding. It was not a request for deportation funding. It was not an endorsement of the enforcement-first framework I have spent my career opposing, and context matters. The answer was disciplined, practiced, and for a moment effective, because it gave her allies a path back to comfort. Maybe this was nuance. Maybe this was a local exception. Maybe Rubio had overplayed the document. But Rubio did not fight the reframe. He simply picked up the same letter, turned to page 2, paragraph 3, and read the office's own language back into the room. "Your office requested funding for," and I am quoting directly, "ICE enforcement and removal operations in connection with increased case load in the 14th Congressional District," Rubio said. "Is that your office's language, Congresswoman?" The sentence landed with the clean brutality of a locked door, because it did not accuse her of hypocrisy in broad terms. It made her authenticate the words her own staff had sent. AOC shifted into institutional fog, saying her office handled thousands of constituent inquiries, that the language reflected a specific operational context, and that it did not represent her broader legislative agenda. Rubio let her finish because he did not need to interrupt a defense that was already shrinking from moral certainty into administrative caveat. "I understand," he said, setting the letter down as if the first exhibit had already done its job. "Now, while your office was privately requesting additional enforcement resources, I want to share something about the family I mentioned earlier, the Dominguez family of Jackson Heights." The room tightened again because the letter had been damaging, but a letter is abstract until a family name is placed beside it. Rubio explained that the same month AOC's office sent that request, the Dominguez family contacted her constituent services line seeking help with an enforcement-related case, and were told, according to the committee record, that no additional resources were available for their situation. Then he drew the line in plain English. Her office was requesting resources with one hand while telling a family in her own district that those resources did not exist with the other. The Dominguez family was not introduced as a prop, and that was exactly why the room felt the temperature change when Rubio said their name again. They had 3 children in public school. They had lived in Jackson Heights for 9 years. They paid taxes. They followed the rules as they understood them. And when they finally called the congresswoman who had built her image around protecting families like theirs, someone on the other end told them no. Rubio did not dress that contradiction up in outrage, because outrage would have made it easier for AOC to dismiss him as partisan, cruel, or theatrical. He looked at the witness table and stated the fact in the plain language that voters understand faster than any policy paper. Her office asked Washington for resources, then told a family in her district that resources were not available. Then he placed the bigger number beside the smaller wound, reminding her that 14,000 families were waiting for housing in her district, not as a statistic for a press release, but as 14,000 dinner tables where parents had to explain to their children why help still had not come. AOC moved quickly because speed was part of her defense, and in another room against another questioner, it might have worked. She said the root cause was federal underfunding. She said the solution was investment. She said communities were being forced to fight one another for scraps, while Washington refused to fund housing, courts, legal aid, healthcare, and real public safety. It was not a weak answer, which made what happened next more damaging, because Rubio did not try to defeat her philosophy with his philosophy. He simply accepted the premise long enough to introduce someone who lived under the consequences of that premise, a woman whose presence made the argument less academic and far harder to escape. "I appreciate that perspective, Congresswoman," he said, before calling Elena Vargas, owner of La Cocina de Elena, a Dominican restaurant on Southern Boulevard in the Bronx, a legal immigrant, a United States citizen, a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had no interest in becoming a symbol until her own government left her no other option. Elena Vargas walked to the witness table slowly, not with the polish of a professional witness, but with the careful dignity of someone who had ironed her navy dress that morning, because she still believed a public room deserved respect. She wore a small gold cross that caught the overhead light when she sat down, and her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone before pressing her palms flat to steady herself. The gallery quieted without being ordered to, because there are moments in politics when even the people who came to cheer a team recognize that an ordinary citizen has brought something more dangerous than a slogan into the room. Vargas explained that she loved her neighborhood, that she had opened her restaurant at 5:30 every morning for years, that she knew her customers, their children, their illnesses, their layoffs, and the quiet humiliations of people who sometimes needed food before they had money. Then she explained what had changed. Classrooms with 42 children and 1 teacher, an emergency room where her cook's wife waited 11 hours with chest pains, and a cousin who waited 9 years to enter the country legally while watching the rules bend for others in ways no politician wanted to explain on camera. That was the first wound, but it was not the one that changed the hearing. The sentence that changed the hearing came after Vargas reminded the committee that she had voted for AOC twice, believed her twice, trusted her twice, and then called her office 11 times over 2 years, with the kind of patience that only working people are expected to show. AOC leaned toward the microphone and tried to soften the moment, calling her Elena, saying her experience mattered, saying the challenges she described were exactly why community investment mattered. And for a second, the old political reflex returned, the attempt to absorb the complaint into a broader moral framework. Vargas looked at her with something worse than anger, because anger still gives a politician something dramatic to survive, while disappointment just sits there and refuses to be spun. "Congresswoman, you hear me today because there are cameras," Vargas said, and the line cut through the room with the precision of a citizen who had finally stopped asking permission to be heard. Rubio did not rush to rescue the moment from silence, because silence was doing more damage than any follow-up could have done. He asked what happened after the 8th call, and Vargas answered that a young man in AOC's office told her they could not help with her concern and directed her to Pueblo Adelante Community Alliance. She said the organization did not handle her type of issue, offered to connect her with other services, and left her with the same problem she had before, except now the rejection had been outsourced. Then came the grant trail, the part of the testimony that turned a neglected phone call into a political structure. Vargas had learned that Pueblo Adelante received a $2.3 million federal community development grant, and that the Congresswoman's office had helped direct that grant. In that instant, every viewer who had ever been transferred, redirected, put on hold, given a number, given a website, given a promise, and given nothing else understood the accusation before Rubio had to say it. Rubio turned from Vargas to the camera, and that choice mattered because he was no longer speaking only to a committee room. He was speaking to the viewers who had watched politicians build careers on compassion, while ordinary constituents learned that compassion often came with a staffer, a referral, a form, and no result. Mrs. Vargas did everything right, Rubio said, emphasizing that she came legally, built a business, paid taxes, called her congresswoman 11 times, and was still treated like a problem to be moved off the desk. Then he asked the sentence that transformed the hearing from policy dispute into public indictment. If Mrs. Vargas was not a priority, then who was? It was not clever. It was not theatrical. It was not a slogan. And that was why it worked, because the people watching at home could feel the answer forming in their own anger before anyone in the room dared to say it aloud. Behind AOC, her senior aide was texting rapidly, and another staffer had the stillness of someone realizing the prepared binder did not contain the thing the hearing had become. AOC's jaw set, and the cameras caught a version of her face that did not fit the usual clipped montage of defiance, because this was not a viral fight over ideology anymore. This was constituent services, response rates, redirected calls, grant money, and a woman who had voted for her twice explaining that she only got heard after the cameras arrived. Rubio thanked Vargas with a restrained respect that made the testimony feel even heavier, because he did not need to embellish what she had already put on the record. Then, AOC leaned into the microphone, sharper now, more controlled now, and made the move everyone knew was coming. If records were on trial, she was ready to put Rubio's record under the same lights. She produced correspondence between Rubio's office and GEO Group, one of the largest private immigration detention operators in the country, and held it up with the confidence of a politician who had finally found familiar ground again. She cited public filings, political donations, a $50,000 contribution from GEO Group's Political Action Committee, and a letter from Rubio's office concerning a facility expansion permit review in South Florida. Then she widened the attack into his voting record, saying he had voted against community development block grants, emergency housing assistance, and legal immigration pathway expansion, while now presenting himself as the defender of families crushed by bureaucracy. The gallery split the way political rooms split when a counterpunch lands hard enough to give one side oxygen, and for a moment AOC's supporters could pretend the hearing had returned to the contest they understood. Rubio let her finish every word, because he knew the more time she spent attacking his record, the clearer it would become that she was trying to leave Elena Vargas behind. Rubio waited until she was finished, not because he had nothing to say, but because the counterattack itself was useful evidence. He did not remove his glasses, did not shuffle papers to look busy, did not perform wounded innocence for the cameras, because a man defending his ego would have taken the bait, and a man prosecuting a record would not. The Congresswoman is correct about those votes, he said, with a bluntness that took the room out of its partisan rhythm. He acknowledged the votes, acknowledged the public record, acknowledged the GEO Group PAC donation, and stated that the facility permit followed standard review procedures with no expedited treatment. Then he leaned forward just enough to make the next sentence feel less like a rebuttal and more like a trap closing. "But I want to point something out, Congresswoman," Rubio said. "You just spent 2 minutes talking about my record, and I let you finish." The gallery went still, because everyone understood he was not complimenting her. He was identifying the escape route she had just tried to use. Every second you spend talking about my voting history is a second you do not have to answer the question of why Elena Vargas called your office 11 times and nobody picked up the phone. That sentence stripped the counterattack down to its real function, and once it was named as evasion, the room could not unhear it. AOC had thrown Rubio's record onto the table, hoping to widen the frame, and Rubio narrowed it back to a ringing phone. That was the discipline of the moment, and that was why it damaged her more than any insult could have. The viewers who already disliked her did not need a new reason to distrust her, but now they had something better than dislike. They had a document, a witness, a grant trail, and a question she had not answered. Rubio reminded the room that his parents came to the country with nothing, that they called their congressman's office once, and that someone answered. Then he said the sentence that made the moral issue brutally simple. This was not about left or right. It was about whether the office did the job. AOC began to respond, but Rubio was already moving to the next exhibit, and the shift confused the room because Document 3 appeared, at first glance, to help her. It was a program evaluation from her own district office, highlighting the Bronx Workforce Pathways Initiative, one of the community programs she had championed as proof that investment could transform lives. The cover page looked like a campaign mailer turned into a government report. Job training, placement rates, community partnership, success story. All the phrases a politician loves because they sound measurable and humane at the same time. AOC looked at the report, then at Rubio, and the confusion flickered across her face before she could fully bury it. Why would he enter a document that made her look competent, effective, and right? "This is an impressive program, Congresswoman," Rubio said, giving the praise enough space to sound sincere. 600 people trained, 400 placed in jobs, and your office managed this initiative directly. Is that correct? AOC studied the document for a few seconds. Careful now, suspicious now, because Rubio had not spent the morning handing her victories without a blade hidden under them. "Yes," she answered, and for a moment her voice regained a measure of command. The Bronx Workforce Pathways Initiative was one of the most successful community development programs in the district's history. Rubio nodded and said she should be proud of it, which only made the next question feel colder. He asked how it was funded, and AOC answered with the expected architecture: federal community development grant, city matching funds, partnership with 3 local organizations. Then Rubio pressed for the specific budget line that funded the community partnership component, and the polished machine behind AOC began to slow. She conferred with an aide, a whispered exchange barely caught by the microphones, while the aide flipped to the appendix and ran a finger down the page, like someone searching for a safe exit in a building that had already locked its doors. The answer was sitting there in the report, not hidden, not forged, not taken out of context, and therefore much harder to dismiss. The community partnership had been funded by reallocating money from the constituent services budget, the same budget that paid for the staff who answered phones. That was the real cut, and it went deeper than the ICE letter because it exposed a choice. AOC's celebrated success story had not merely appeared through moral clarity and progressive imagination. It had been financed, in part, by draining resources away from the office function that would have served people like Elena Vargas. 400 job placements could be photographed, summarized, clipped, posted, praised, cited, and folded into the mythology of an office that delivered transformation. Unanswered calls could not be photographed, and that was exactly the point. She had not chosen between compassion and cruelty in that budget line. She had chosen between visible success and invisible failure. Rubio did not editorialize the point because the arithmetic already had teeth. So the 400 job placements were funded by reallocating constituent services resources, he said, before asking how many of those 400 people also had pending cases with her office. AOC answered that she would need to review the specific data on that overlap, which was the kind of sentence Washington uses when the answer is either unknown, embarrassing, or both. Rubio accepted it and moved on, because the room had already understood what mattered. The office could produce a glossy program report while failing to answer the citizens who were calling for help. Then he entered the CBO fiscal analysis of the immigration policy framework she had co-sponsored, shifting the hearing from district management to national policy without letting her escape the district consequences. He reminded her that she had cited the Congressional Budget Office as an authoritative source at least 14 times in public statements, then asked whether she accepted their methodology. AOC said, in general, yes, and that small concession gave Rubio permission to use the numbers she had spent years treating as credible. He asked which specific programs in her district she would cut to fund the proposal under the CBO assumptions. And AOC answered with revenue sources: tax reform, defense reallocations, corporate minimum tax adjustments, the familiar future tense vocabulary of people who promise relief after a political miracle occurs. Rubio waited until she finished, then cut through the fog with the simplest possible distinction. He had asked for programs, and she had named revenue sources that did not exist yet. There were 14,000 families on the housing wait list in her district right now, he said. Not after tax reform, not after a perfect budget deal, not after another speech. Then, Rubio read from a constituent letter belonging to Maria Chen of Queens, a legal immigrant from Taiwan who had waited 7 years for citizenship. She attended every appointment, filed every form, passed every test, paid every fee, and did everything the country asked her to do without complaint. When a processing delay added 11 months to her wait, and she contacted AOC's office for help, the response log said the matter was not a current priority for the Congresswoman's office at this time. Rubio did not need to raise his voice after that, because 7 years of patience had just been answered by 7 words of bureaucratic dismissal. AOC began to say the numbers required context, but half a second of broken cadence told the room that context was no longer arriving fast enough to save her. Rubio noticed the crack, but he did not strike it immediately, because an impatient man would have chased the stumble and given AOC a chance to turn it into victimhood. Instead, he said again that when his mother had a problem, she called her congressman's office and someone answered, and he made that sentence sound less like nostalgia than a minimum job description. Then he announced a 5-minute recess, just as AOC reached for her water, and her staff began moving toward her with the urgent choreography of people trying to repair a machine, while the cameras were still pointed at it. As she lifted the glass, Rubio added one sentence almost casually, almost softly, and somehow that made it more threatening. When we return, I have one question. Just one. During the recess, the hearing did not pause. It escaped into the hallway, into phones, into clips, into whispered panic, and into the faces of staffers who had suddenly realized this was no longer a policy hearing they could message their way through. Outside room 219, AOC's communications director and legislative aide talked over each other against the marble wall, one checking a phone every few seconds, while the other shook his head with the dead-eyed disbelief of someone watching a prepared strategy die in public. The hallway crowd had doubled since morning. The rope line had to be moved, and a woman in a blue cardigan called her daughter to say she needed to watch the entire thing from the beginning. Not the clip, not the commentary, but the whole slow collapse. When the committee returned, AOC looked steadier, her posture reset, her jaw tight, her face arranged into the expression of a fighter who had decided she would take the next blow standing. But the room had already seen the half-second failure, and viewers at home had already felt what political instincts always recognize before the pundits say it. The defense was no longer leading the facts, it was chasing them. Rubio's tone shifted when the hearing resumed. Quieter now, almost gentle, the way a prosecutor speaks when the verdict is no longer the question and only the damage remains. He read from the transcript of a town hall AOC had held on April 14th, where a constituent asked what would happen to a family member's pending deportation case, and AOC publicly promised to personally make sure that family was protected. He asked whether she had intervened personally, and she answered that her office had taken appropriate steps, the kind of answer designed to sound responsible, while avoiding the only detail that mattered. Rubio said he had the case file, and that her office had sent one email to an agency she had publicly called corrupt and demanded be abolished. One email, one gesture, one bureaucratic pebble thrown at a wall, and yet on camera she had allowed a frightened family to believe the full weight of her office was moving for them. Then he tied the knot that AOC's team had failed to cut during recess. The organization listed as a resource partner in that email was Pueblo Adelante, the same organization Elena Vargas had been redirected to, the same organization that had received $2.3 million in federal grant funding with help from AOC's office. Different family, different borough, different year, same door, same redirect, same political convenience wrapped in the language of community service. What had looked at first like scattered mistakes now hardened into a pattern. Constituents with enforcement-related concerns were not being solved. They were being routed away from the office and toward an organization that benefited from the very funding stream her office helped arrange. Rubio did not need to call it corruption in that moment, because the room was already doing the math with a coldness no slogan could interrupt. AOC came back hard because she had no choice, and the fire in her voice was real enough to remind everyone why she had become a national figure in the first place. She said every member of Congress handled thousands of cases, that no office could be reduced to a handful of examples, that community organizations existed because government alone could not carry every burden, and that Rubio was trying to criminalize partnership itself. It was sharp, fast, and almost convincing, right up until Rubio asked the one question he had saved all morning. He did not raise his voice, did not lean forward dramatically, did not pound the desk, and did not give her supporters any theatrical excess they could clip into a grievance. How many cases did you actually resolve? The room went still in a way that felt physical, as if every microphone, camera, reporter, staffer, and spectator understood that the hearing had arrived at the single number all the speeches had been avoiding. An aide slid a sheet of paper across the table, only a few inches, but the movement looked enormous because everyone watching knew that paper carried the answer AOC should have known before she ever walked into the room. She looked down, and her eyes moved across the number as if the figure had been written in a language she suddenly wished she could not read. She began with the old cadence, saying every office had a resolution rate that reflected case complexity, jurisdictional limits, agency backlog, and the realities of immigration administration. Then the music stopped, not gradually, not dramatically, but like a wire had been cut inside the sentence. For the first time that morning, AOC was not reframing, not widening, not moralizing, not counterpunching, not turning the question back on Rubio. and not building a larger argument to bury a smaller failure. She tried again, saying she wanted to be clear about her office's constituent service record, and for 3 words, the old rhythm seemed ready to return. Then she looked down at the number again, and whatever sat on that page made the next word impossible. Her hands withdrew from the microphone to her lap. Her mouth closed. Her eyes dropped to the table, and the silence became the answer the committee had been waiting for. Behind her, one aide looked at a phone with no message to send. Another put a hand to her forehead and left it there. And in the gallery, a woman nodded slowly, not with joy, but with confirmation. Rubio spoke into the silence with the respect that made the moment more devastating, because mockery would have cheapened what the record had already accomplished. "I have no further questions for this witness," he said, thanking AOC for her testimony before turning to the committee and laying out the ledger one more time. 11 calls, 7 years, 1 promise made on camera, and $2.3 million directed to an organization that did not solve one person's problem. Then came the verdict, clean and brutal. This was not a system that failed. It was a system working exactly as designed, only it had not been designed for Elena Vargas. Rubio requested formal constituent response data from every member who co-sponsored the legislation and a review of the grant allocation process for Pueblo Adelante and similar organizations referenced in the testimony. By evening, the footage was everywhere, but the clip that dominated the internet was not the CBO exchange, not the GEO group counterattack, not even Rubio's final question. It was Elena Vargas looking into the camera and saying she called 11 times. Because that line did what political media rarely does. It made the ordinary citizen more powerful than the elected official. AOC canceled her MSNBC appearance that night, then canceled 2 more scheduled hits that week, and for 48 hours her social media accounts went silent in a way her allies could not explain, and her critics did not need to. Within 72 hours, 3 co-sponsors quietly withdrew their names from the legislation. Without speeches, without press conferences, without moral language, just names disappearing from a bill no one wanted to defend on camera anymore. Even commentators who had spent years defending her began asking why Pueblo Adelante had to be answered before anyone could move on to the broader policy conversation. Rubio was stopped in a hallway afterward and asked how he felt about the hearing, and he did not slow down long enough to perform victory. He said 11 calls, 2 answers, and $2.3 million for an organization that did not help one person. And if that was not corruption, it was at the very least a betrayal of every person who voted for her. Pueblo Adelante issued a brief statement welcoming review of its programs and partnerships, the kind of statement Washington releases when no one knows what the records will show, but everyone knows the records are now coming. The next morning at La Cocina de Elena, a regular customer asked Elena Vargas what happened now, and she wiped the counter while the small television above the register replayed the hearing. She looked up at the screen and said she was going to call again, and this time